Good afternoon, everyone, from IIT Gandhinagar, where we continue our course of Indian knowledge systems dedicated particularly to pre-colonial literatures of India. And we've covered quite a wide field already, not only Sanskritic, but literatures also in regional languages. But we felt from the beginning that we should have something about literature for children, because this is something that is such a strong tradition in the whole Indian literary and cultural landscape, whether orally or in written form. And therefore we turn to Professor Diti Vyas, who is an expert in this field. And she is currently an associate professor in the Writing and Communications Department at Anand National University, right here in Ahmedabad. And she's had extensive experience in research teaching, in particular in the field of children's literature. I will not read out a whole profile, which is quite extensive and can be seen on our website, iks.itgn.ac.in. But the main point is that her dedication to children's literature and all the way to the current period, to today's India, is what made us invite her. And we look forward to these two lectures that are going to enrich the course very much. So Professor Diti, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Danino, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to my alma mater back. It's always an honor and a pleasure both. Well, I also come here to talk about a topic which has slowly started entering into the academic discussions. Though, of course, educationally, we all know that children's literature has been important, but academia is slow to welcome this entire body of writing. So if we were to begin our today's talk, and I would want to present to you a collection of works from various Indian languages. I'm sure depending on the mother tongue that you know, you might pick and choose the favorite one or read the titles and remember associations with childhood. So from Panchatantra down to Arabian Nights, from Famous Five to Faster Fene, from Pagla Dashu to Bakor Patel, whether in told format or read out, in print format, children's literature has always been an integral part of everyone's childhood. And any discussion on children's literature is bound to start with the idea of impossibility. And why do we begin with this idea of impossibility is because of the predominance of adults in the entire process of creation, selection, dissemination, and interpretation of literature for children. The whole apostrophe that we have in children's literature is rendered questionable. At the pragmatic level, this impossibility is magnified due to the variety and amorphousness of children's literature. So when we talk about children's literature, we essentially think of folk and fairy tales, we talk about myths and legends, we talk about nursery rhymes and fan fiction, we talk about songs and computer games. And this is the reason when Jonathan Cott was doing his compilation in form of masterworks of children's literature, this is in Western context, he comes up with this whole idea of this sprawling mass of text. He said it's like a collection of oranges and apples, landscape paintings and garbage pails. No one has been able to offer a generally acceptable description of this sprawling mass of text. When we now specifically come to the Indian context, this impossibility is magnified manifold times. And this is because of the sheer cultural and linguistic plurality in the Indian context. So the 8th schedule of Constitution of India recognizes 22 scheduled languages. Creators of children's literature, which is published by AVIC, Association of Writers and Illustrators, identifies, this is a 2003 work, it identifies close to 16 languages in which authors for children's literature produce writing. However, if I were to bring in this very important document, People's Linguistic Survey of India, it identifies 780 languages. Very interestingly, each of these 780 languages have one oral tale and one oral song at least documented in this work, which means there is so much more to the sprawling mass that our eyes can meet. And what we are trying to do is dig in to this mass as we go ahead with our today's session. At the level of studies, academic studies, children's literature scholars basically deal with this linguistic and cultural plurality in three primary ways. Number one, it happens by charting the separate trajectories of literature in various languages. This other way is by grouping Indian children's literature into two distinct categories, which is literature in English vis-a-vis literature in regional languages. This is another strand. And the third strand is coming up with overarching conclusions about Indian children's literature in general. I seek to bring about conflicts and complications in these three strands in the course of my discussion today. But before that, let's talk about the beginnings of children's literature. So the idea of impossibility becomes almost absolute when we talk about this body of writing called pre-colonial children's literature, as histories of children's literature in India typically begin with 19th century. And typically they begin with the arrival of the British missionaries and beginning of commercial printing. So here are some examples of what the children's literature scholars are saying. This is K. Jamuna, who is stating that the conscious efforts to develop children's literature in different languages began sometime towards the end of 19th century or beginning of 20th century. And it was the contact with the West that encouraged Indian writers to produce literature for children on scientific lines. There's another view much more clearly pronouncing the entire gift from the West by categorizing children's literature with other things that have been imported from the West. So we have Rimi Chatterjee and Nilanjana Gupta, who are stating that the category of children's literature, like the novel, like the newspaper, the patent leather shoes, have been imported into India by the British. And then this was very enthusiastically and quickly taken over by certain fractions of Indians. Well, so if we look at these distinct histories which come out from individual bodies of writing, which we call children's literature, this idea is supported to a certain extent. So here is a list that I have compiled, just few languages to give an example of when do the histories of children's literature in these languages begin. So conscious efforts to develop children's literature as a separate body, as distinct from that of literature for adults, we said begin in a colonial, under the colonial influence. And if we trace the historiography of various language literatures, it starts typically with 19th century in Bengal, because it was believed that Bengal facilitated the socio-political conditions in Bengal, facilitated the interaction with the British. And therefore, typically we begin in 1818, where the first magazine for children was published under the editorship of Marshman. It's very interesting. One history actually says Chota Henry, which was a translation by Mary Martha Sherwood, is the first Indian book. This is what is mentioned in one of the histories of Bengali literature. So if we then move on from 1818 and look at Uriya, it says Christian missionaries set up a mission press in Cuttack. This is in the year 1937, and the publishing began, and it began under the leadership of Amos Statton and Reverend Leslie. Then we move to Assam and we see a similar story happening here. So we say that in 1850s, it was the missionaries who came to Assam, and by, around the same time, we have, there's actually a conflict in terms of years. There are parallel histories that we see happening here. But tentatively between 1836 to 1850s, we have this magazine called Arunodaya, which was started by American Baptist Mission. If we look at the history of children's literature in Tamil, we are told that Christian Society of Narcoil published the first children's magazine, which was Bala Diphai, and this was in 1840. Punjabi, it happened in 1849, and this came with the establishment of, the precursor of the education society there called Pax Britannica. Also very interesting is the fact that children's literature in English has been recorded to have started much later. This is close to 20th century, as we refer to Dangopal Mukherjee as one of the former proponents of writing for children in English. So after emerging as a separate body of writing in the years that we just mentioned, children's literature then developed within the framework of education. So this development within the boundaries of formal education is a characteristic which a children's literature scholar called Manorma Jaffa finds common to the histories of various colonizing nations. So we have textbooks and magazines being published. We have the establishment of School Book Society of Bengal, which happened in 1817. In Gujarat, we had Alexander Forbes, who established Gujarat Vernacular Society in 1857. And after that, Kavi Dalpat Ram started publishing textbooks for children in Gujarati. In Assami language, we have Anandaram Dekiyal, whose work called Larar Mitra is supposed to have continued the tradition of writing for children, which was set up by the British missionaries. We have again similar stories coming from Tamil, where we have Henry Alfred Krishna Pillai, who has his, in his work, he has these little prayers about Christ being mentioned, which are termed as the forerunner of children's literature in Tamil language. And a similar story again comes from Bengal, where we have Keshav Chandra Sen, whose magazine Balak Bandhu actually, carried forward the tradition of magazines and textbook writing. So this is what separate history charting does to the whole story, the whole narrative of what is happening to children's literature in various regional languages. So now if I move on from here, when we come to the post-independence era particularly, this has been credited as an era where creativity, originality, modernity came into the post-independence writing, and we have documentation which talks about establishment of National Book Trust, Children's Book Trust, NCRT, international collaborations, which actually are cited as the reasons for growth. By now, the idea of temporal progression is building up, and this entire build-up of temporal progression comes with its own set of value judgments, right? And I would want to specifically highlight those value judgments here. So we have Manorma Jaffa again, who identifies three distinct phases of the growth of Indian children's literature as a whole, as a body. And she says that we start with oral and traditional literature, and then we move to the translations and adaptations, and there is a lot of abridging that happens. And this triumphal march of children's literature culminates in the form of contemporary children's writing. And if we just look at the screen. I'm going to grab my pointer in order to particularly highlight what she's talking about. So she says the modern, original, creative writing has developed only in the last century. We also have Varsha Das, who talks about this whole shift from very, very educational and moral development framework to writing for children, which is enjoyable, which is satisfying, which is extremely entertaining. So, you know, the archetypal shift from education to entertainment is what the shift captures. And then we have Santini Govindan, who in her research, in her study by the Department of Culture and Tourism, she concludes the entire history writing by saying that with the arrival of the British in India, the whole story began, and until then there was a paucity of creatively written books for children. After the British consolidated their position in India, books were brought out in English and regional languages to cater exclusively to children. What remains extremely problematic, and I think this is what I would want to particularly highlight, is that this historiography retains the idea of progressive growth, progressive temporal growth of children's literature by aligning the specificities in different languages. And I'd want to bring that out very, very clearly by, giving a free way to various voices that we hear from the regional sections of children's literature writing. So while English has been credited with this, and we are talking about the post-independence children's literature now, English, has been talked about as, it has come of age. The whole writing has come of age. It is firmly established in the literary map. It turns into a commercially viable category with leading publishers like Penguin and Rupa entering into the Indian market with a children's segment. So this whole, the victory side, the triumph side is highlighted through children's literature in English. Whereas we hear a lot of crisis situation emerging from regional languages. So here is an example from Punjabi where, and I would want you to specifically focus on the language of, how is the lat pronounced. So we have Pal Kohli and Amrik Singh, who are talking about children's literature in Punjabi, and they are saying that we are still to produce an Enid Blyton and her books with the child appeal that gives young readers a most welcome thrill. We still have to establish a Hamlin for publishing and promoting knowledge through entertainment. We have to yet make well-directed, well-planned, serious beginning towards potential readability. Similar stories are heard from children's literature in other languages. Gujarati is what we hear, about, where Somalal Patel is talking about the quality issues in Gujarati children's literature after 1980s. So he says that till 1980s, the growth has been satisfactory in terms of variety, creativity, and novelty. However, post 1990s, we don't see any original creation, and there are no signs of enthusiasm happening in Gujarati children's literature. Sindhi, the situation is even more critical. So we have Kundaraj Balwani, who says that children's literature in Sindhi progressed feebly in comparison to the literatures in other languages. That is because the books are printed in black and white. Okay, and there's no single store in the entire country where Sindhi children's literature is sold. In fact, continuing its printing itself could be an achievement for Sindhi literature, is what has been stated. So these are some voices that we hear from the individual charting of histories. But what again is extremely difficult and which is relevant to the topic today is in their zeal to support this whole idea of history as progression, and in order to credit the present, the contemporary children's literature, and bring it modern modernity and creativity, what is happening is this whole body of writing for literature, writing for children, which was there in the pre-colonial era, has been either ignored, or it has been touched as a mere point of origin, a predecessor with no real value, or it has been severely criticized also. I would want to highlight few examples here, and here is what Amit Dasgupta in his Telling Tales talks about. This is a place where he's talking about Panchatantra, and I would want you to identify how this whole idea of Panchatantra is sort of brought out to the readers through the idea of universal appeal. So there's universal appeal he talks about, and he says the tales from Panchatantra and the Little Prince and Grimm's fairy tales and Aesop's tales and Alice in Wonderland, these are all stories which live in a happy world of a utopia of internationalism, happily transacted across the countries and happily consumed by people. So this is an enjoyment which cuts across barriers of language and culture. And here I would want to specifically point out that if we look at the present scenario and why we need a session like this in today's scenario is if we look at the market position of children's literature, the world children's literature. This is Emma O'Sullivan, whose study reminds us that in the context of global, what we call global children's literature, the countries that give, that is export, actually receive the least. So which means here are some numbers: 70 and 80% of books available to non-European and non-American countries are by European and American authors. So we have to take this whole idea of happy internationalism in a utopian world with a lot of mindfulness. On the other hand, there is a slightly different strand which is visible where we have some authors, some critics who are complaining about children's literature of the pre-colonial era. And this is again Manorma Jaffa bringing in, trying to project it as a predecessor, but a miserable antecedent. So she says that the value system that dominated the themes of pre-colonial traditional literature was upper class in terms of its orientation. There was contempt for women, and I'm going to touch upon this in tomorrow's session. It focuses on individual achievements, and there is the most prominent objection: you're writing for child, but there is a complete lack of child's perspective. I think what I'm going to do is address this first idea about lack of child's perspective. So where were the children of the pre-colonial era? Let's ask this very question. And I'm going to take you through some classical texts and some folk traditions to identify where were children, what was happening to the children of the pre-colonial era. Here is Vanaparva of Mahabharata, where in the story of Ashtavakra, who has 8 bends, he is referred to as Kumar. And in the story in Mahabharata, when the Pandavas are on exile, sage Lamosa actually mentions this story, and he talks about, this is the translation which I have up here, which says, a gray head does not make an elder, nor by years, nor by gray hair, nor by riches, nor by relations did the seers make the law. He who is great to us is the one who has learning. I take you again to Kalidasa, and we have from the 7th Anka, 17th Shloka, which talks about Dushyant's feeling of looking at the child, but it's not merely a father looking at a son, it's also a culture which is celebrating children. And here is what he says, that, the innocent smiles and the charming prattle, indistinct accents are actually what make, an adult's life worth living. Taking again to Griha Sukta, which actually categorizes the evolution of a child into multiple ritualistic stages, starting with Namakarma, we have Annaprashana, Chudakarma, we have Aksharabhyasa, Upanayana, and these are the stages which it talks about in very elaborate details. We also have legends like Nachiketa, where we come to know that children were allowed, a lot of freedom of movement. We see Nachiketa walking directly to Yama in order to get answers, in order to get Atmavidya from the Yama. So the whole question is, if there is so much of exaltation of children, then is it only specific to classical texts, or do we also have some other references to validate it? So if we look at this very interesting body of writing which is developing about indigenous pre-colonial childhood, and I would want to specifically talk about Bengal because a lot of very interesting work is coming out in this aspect with regards to Mangala Kavyas. And this is a work, the first one particularly, which talks about how, Mangala Kavyas, which were basically folkloric repository that started in 15th century and continued all through the 19th century, actually exalted children, and not only children, also their play. So the work talks about how children were allowed to engage into play, depending, of course, upon their caste and gender, without any direct control or regulation by adult interventions. So these are some references that we find from the classical and folkloric texts. Now, then the question is, what did the pre-colonial children, if they were so important, what did they engage with? What was being consumed, if we were to use the terminology of today? So then let us go to what we call Gurukulas and Adhinams in South, Madhukaris or Pathshalas, which were basically in charge of institutionalized educational care, albeit there are references which say that this was available to a few, which could be contested. Here, the students were given passages from epics and Puranas, and they were expected to recite them. So learning of children here was centered on performance, which was based on memorization and recitation. So these were the two poles of the learning. And the children, the teacher would call attention to the correct pronunciation, accent, but rather than spewing back what they have learned, the children were also expected to perform. They were also expected to, chant or perform what they have learned. Record states that if we talk specific examples of 16th century in Orissa, there's a very interesting text called Kamala Lochana Chautissa. This is 16th century text by Balram Das, who was a saint poet in Orissa. And these were immensely popular amongst children. Now, what is extremely interesting is, I have the original text here, which I'm going to try and read and then demonstrate the magic of the text. So it says, please pardon me for my non-Uriya pronunciation here. I'm just going to read out the Devanagari. Kamala Lochana Shri Hari Karena Shankha Chakra Gadadhari Khagasane Khagapati Khatvanti Lakshmi Saraswati Garudasane Murari Gopare Akhile Bachuri. Now, if you look at the first letters of the entire Chautissa, the first letters actually embody a memorization tool. It says Ka, Kha, Ga, and it actually continues. So which means it's a form of ballad where stanzas are arranged as per consonants in Uriya alphabet, and this worked as memorization tool for children. Do we not call it children's literature is a question that I would now continuously keep posing. Then we all hear stories about pre-colonial children had to share their literature with the adults. Let's try and probe into this whole idea of shared literature now. And before we go there, let's try and put it in the context of the West. So unlike the Western belief that the child is a tabula rasa, an empty being who needs to be filled up with everything that is worth learning by parenting and training and children's literature included, the Indian worldview was different. So in India, in the pre-colonial times, though the children were expected to grow as per the social norms of the adult world, and we saw that in the context of the ritualistic stages which were identified. However, children were allowed autonomous and self-directing movements as individuals. Though these movements were fraught with the structures of power other than age, children per se were seen in more egalitarian terms. And this is what I am going to try and demonstrate through pointing out some exemplars. This trust, this innate trust in the constructive power of children comes as a sharp contrast now, which is undermined with the categorization of children's literature as a distinct genre. And once you say that children need a separate body of writing, which is literature, you are almost assuming that they don't have the power to, they don't have the intelligence or discretion to make their choices, and therefore you have to make it everything available to them in a platter, in a form that they can consume. So this whole publisher-led stratification of audiences that we see happening thanks to the Western context actually makes, and again, I'm shifting slightly to the Western academic discussion, and I'll bring it back to India and Indian children's literature. So because of this stratification, we have Jacqueline Rose, who actually says that, this whole division of readership is so problematic that there's nothing called children's literature that can ever exist, says Jacqueline Rose. And she talks about the impossibility of children's literature. And there is a very interesting, crisp sentence which summarizes her entire perspective. She says, if children's fiction builds an image of the child, it does so in order to secure the child which is outside the book, the one who does not come easily within its grasp. So she talks about the whole category of children's literature as a design, as a trap, which sets a trap in order to construct children in the image that the adults think. Similarly, we have Leslie Uberstein, who actually is a proponent of what is childhood studies in the realm of children's literature studies. And this is, again, the context is West. She talks about this idea of a voiceless child. And she says that because children per se have no voice in the hierarchies of our society, and because the adults silence them so much, they try to create a voice of children. Children's literature is nothing but it's going to give us back what the adults want the child to be. So, you don't call it children's literature, it's basically adults literature offered to children is, and therefore she says, don't look at that. Let's look at other avenues in order to study children's literature. We have Barbara Wall, who actually then distinguishes between these three forms of addresses, wherein she says that I would particularly want to highlight what is called single address, which is directly talking to the child. So, and we call this at times infantile. If you do a baby talk to the child, she says, this is no good. It's like 19th century Victorian fiction. Then she talks about dual address, where she says that basically you are talking to the child, but actually you're talking to the adults. There's a collusion with the adults. You're using the child's shoulder in order to reach out to the gatekeepers who are going to buy the books for them. So that's dual address. And these are all narrative styles that she's talking about. And finally, she's talking about this idea of double address, wherein in double address, she says that this is speaking to the child and the adult at the same time. And she ranks this form of narration extremely high. I would want to propose that what we had in pre-colonial children's literature was actually double address. This whole fluidity and the porosity of literature of pre-colonial times actually ensured that the child was being addressed at the same time when the adult was being talked about. And in this form of address, as Wall says, while the language, the concepts, and the tone is accessible to the child is no longer central. And I'm quoting from Wall. She says, something other than purely child's interest dominates. And she says, this is valued, this should be done. So in 1992, we again have this Foucauldian idea of power, becoming extremely popular. And we have Western scholars, Rex and Wendy, who in their stories of childhood, shifting agendas of child concern, they acknowledge this whole idea of constructive child. So what we mean by constructive child actually is that young person constructs her own identity out of what is culturally available rather than merely being a passive recipient. In fact, it is now that this whole porosity in terms of crossing over, which is thanks to the unprecedented success of Rowling's Harry Potter books and Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, that we now call it crossover, something that goes from freely circulates between the adult and children. Whereas our pre-colonial literature was actually crossover way back, right? So then I would want to now deal with the question of where did these crossovers happen? So if it was a crossover, where did that happen? So if we now go to the typical crossover junctions, and I'm using the terminology from Tamil storytelling, Puram is exterior, the outside. Community storytelling was the norm in the pre-colonial times. So these crossovers could have happened in the quadrangles and pillared corridors of temples, in the palaces of princes, in the mansions of wealthy merchants, in the fairgrounds, market squares, and under the spreading banyan tree in the villages. Though these performances were rarely exclusively for children, children were included in these performances. So these storytellings from Mahabharata, Ramayana, Puranas, and the various other folk forms that we see, like Vilupattu from Tamil Nadu, we have Ojapalli from Assam, we have Tholpavakuttu from Kerala, which is actually a very interesting story. How did Tholpavakuttu originate? This is performed in goddess Bhadrakali temples originally. And it was, the story that goes with it is, after the whole Ramayana happened and the Ravana was defeated, but goddess Bhadrakali actually was fighting with demons in Sri Lanka. And she said, I didn't watch the whole battle. I want to see it all over again. And the form Tholpavakutti came into being where, goddess Bhadrakali had now a second chance to see the battle happening in form of the leather puppets. So these were the places where children exercised their constructive power. They could attend to or ignore the performances without parental controls or adult censorships. So if typical Tholpavakuttu performance would take 21 days, and the parents would not tell the child that, see, this is something not worth your attention, please don't come on day 4. That surely would not have happened. It's a series of events where children were a part of. So regional, and I would want to mention here a very, very important role that regional translations played in making these stories, these epics accessible to children and to non-Sanskrit literate audiences. Particularly, I want to bring out the history of children's literature in Kerala, where Sanskrit education was considered extremely prestigious. It was a Deva Bhasha, and translations in form of work like Panchatantra Kilipattam. Panchatantra Kilipattu is a story. Kilipattu is a story it's a parrot song. So this is Panchatantra Kilipattu, and a work like Sri Krishna Charitam Mani Pravalam, both by Kunjan Nambiar, actually made even the backward sections, the younger people who were not literate in Sanskrit, access and enjoy what was happening, in the adult world too. In fact, if I were to look at one of the versions of this book, we have Kunjan Nambiar, who's actually talking about the intention of the book, and I quote, that this is the book for the use of children who are afraid of voluminous texts, unquote. So these adaptations some of these adaptations also use their unique positioning to make alterations in the classical traditions. So we have a classic Uriya text, Sarala Ramayana, Sarala Mahabharata, written by Sarala Das. This is a 15th century text composed by somebody who calls himself Shudra Muni. So Sarala Das says that, I'm a peasant by birth and I do not know the ways of scriptures, but this man from his position of marginality is actually reworking the female character. So you see a very strong-headed Parvati, and you see Ganga, who is fierce in opinion making. We see Subhadra, who takes initiative and actually proposes Arjuna. And the women are, in short, extremely strong-headed and assertive. We also see that this work gives, a lot of space to the marginal characters like Hidimba and Ghatotkach. So revisions are also happening. At the same time, newer forms are in development. So we also have in Assam, Rama Saraswati, again a saint poet, who has come up with this new form of storytelling in 15th century, which is called Badha Kavya. So what he actually does is he brings out he actually picks up characters from epics, and he talks about how these, heroes of Mahabharata and Ramayana, Arjuna and Bhima, Rama, they killed demons with the supernatural powers. And these are recorded to have been providing entertainment across classes, across ages. So there are a lot of revisions that these translations are doing. The second place, along with Puram, where a lot of very interesting storytelling happens and which is for the most part unrecorded, is in Akkam, which is interior. And this is what A.K. Ramanujan calls context-sensitive storytelling. And we have Kalidasa's Meghdut describing the typical setting of storytelling, where he says that, village elders who are well-versed in Udayana tales, skillful storytellers, who when they visit their kin, they recount old tales. So again, I go back to Ramanujan, a very, very prolific folklorist and a collector of folklore, who says that oral tales are actually only a grandmother away, sometimes a cousin away, and all the times kitchen away. Right, so these tales were, tailored to the specific needs of the children. Unlike the print world, where the publishers or printers who produce reading material to sell by attracting and satisfying the adult gatekeepers, here was a customized version of storytelling. And let me illustrate this through a story, again from the collection of A.K. Ramanujan. So here is a Tamil version of the story. It says, and I'm sure a lot of you might have heard this story at some point of time in some format. So this is a story about Sister Crow and Sister Sparrow. And Sister Crow and Sister Sparrow are friends. The crow has a house of cow dung and the sparrow has the one of stone. A big storm washes away the crow's house and she goes to the sparrow and knocks at her door. Because the sparrow is feeding her children, she asks the crow to wait. The crow knocks again. The sparrow this time is feeding her husband. The crow knocks for the third time. The sparrow is putting her children to sleep now. Finally, she lets the crow in and offers several places to sleep. Crow chooses to sleep in a sack which is full of chickpea. All the night along, she munches the chickpeas and she makes katum katum sound. Whenever the sound would come, the sparrow would ask, like, what is this noise? And the crow would say, nothing really. Do you remember you gave me a betel nut? I'm just biting on the betel nut. By the morning, she had finished off all the chickpeas in the sack. And of course, what happens when you eat chickpeas, you can't control your bowel movements. So that happened to the crow. She fills the sack with her excrement before she leaves. Sparrow's children go there in the morning to get chickpeas and they find muck. And Sparrow is extremely angry. She invites the crow again to visit. And when the crow is about to sit down this time, she puts a hot iron spatula under her and burns her behind, and the crow flees, crying kaka in pain. This is a Tamil version. Then there's a Gujarati version which came my way, which I heard from my own grandmother. So the first part of the story remains the same, but in the second part, there's a change. So it pours, the crow fills the sack with the excrement. That bit is done. Now the next day, again, it rains very profusely. The crow comes again knocking at the door. And this time the crow has to sleep in the same sack, which is filled with its own muck. So depending upon what you want to tell to the children, whether you want them to be toilet trained or you want them to pass on a message of poetic justice, how cruelly you want to do it and how gently you want to do it, you tweak your story and create your own story in your oral narration. And that's the power of orality, which I wanted to point out through this little story. We'll have more storytelling happening in towards the end of this session. I would want to bring out this very interesting way in which Uriya storytellers close their stories. They say, my story is over. And then they would make a statement like, the flowering plant dies. Typically, there's no connection with the flowering plant and the story that has gone ahead. Now, if a child is interested, the child would ask, so why did the flowering plant die? And then starts another story. But if the child has gone off to sleep, not interested, the story ends there. So which means there are a lot of these interesting gaps. Constructive power of the audience, of the children, is being exercised here. And one place I would want to, before I go here, I would want to talk about this very interesting bit from Konkani tradition of storytelling. Can you believe Konkani has 200 types of storytelling? So there are certain stories that you can tell under a peepal tree. There are stories that you can tell in the yard of the home, in the front yard, backyard. There are stories that you can say in winter and summer. Such sophisticated storytelling structure is what we see coming from our regional languages. And coming back to the idea of how oral storytelling for children opened up spaces for them, I would want to bring out this whole tradition of riddles, which has been mostly ignored in children's storytelling, children's literature histories. So riddles have this very interesting history in India. We also, have references. Archer Taylor and Durga Bhagwat have demonstrated references that take them back to Mahabharata, and the theological discussions that happen in form of riddles. Dundee is discussing the literary value of riddles. But when did the riddles become secular? This is where we enter Hindi children's literature with Amir Khusro. And this is Amir Khusro, who is actually talking about riddles, making them accessible to people in what is called Khari Boli in Hindi. So we have a Booj Paheli example by Amir Khusro, again, very, very interesting. It says, Biso Kasar Kaat Diya, beheaded 20, Na Marana Khoon Kiya. Okay, So the heads of all 20 were chopped off, but killing was not done. The bloodshed did not happen. Booch Paheli is a form where the answer is already hidden in the Paheli, in the riddle. So if you look at this, Na and Khoon are already a part of the structure of the Paheli, and Nakhun would mean fingernails or toenails. Would you not call this literature? Is a question that I would want to ask. Now coming to this very, very interesting form, which has been mostly ignored, is children's literature by children themselves. So in the forms such as songs and jokes and plays and incantations, we actually see children producing their literature individually or in collaboration. And I bring to you an example from a very interesting game, song, dance, all question marks here, from Orissa. And I would request, we have a storyteller, a renowned storyteller from Bhubaneswar, Ms. Lipika Mohanty, who has joined us online. I would request Lipika ji to unmute herself, and I'm going to play on the screen how the game is being played. And Lipika ji is going to lend the voice and tell us what would these girls sing. Unfortunately, the video I have here is 2018, and currently what you hear them play is not a traditional song. So we've tried morphing a voice behind for this class. Thank you, Lipika ji, for joining us, and I'll start playing Puchikhela for you.
Puchilo, puchilo, ja ja khunchilo. गहिरा बिलरे मैसी धान केरी केरी खाउची एडाई दे रे गौड़ा भाई बहु बाप घर जाउची बहु बाप घर जाउची बहु बाप घर केउठी मोहरी बजची जेउठी मोहरिया भाई किए रे मोहरी बजाई जिए रे मोहरी बजाई जिए रे सौरिया भाई जिए रे. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lipika ji. So the translation is what you see on the screen. And again, the same question, would you not call this literature for children? If not, then what? But what it does is it blurs the boundaries. And in the same context, I would want to now bring into the frame this tool for storytelling, which is what we call Kavod, from Bassi village. This is a storytelling tool which was traditionally used. So typically it would be closed in the beginning. And as you keep opening the frames, let me make this a little more visible. So as you keep opening the frames, panel by panel, the story is revealed and it expands until the entire story is over. This is where the boundaries between carpentry, storytelling, orality gets blurred, and where do we include this as far as storytelling for children is concerned is a question that we need to ask again. The next allegation or charge that I would want to talk about is this whole idea of there is a shift from didacticism to entertainment that we see as we come to the contemporary times. And this is what I would want to question, interrogate, and challenge. So the meta-narrative that is going on so far is that there's a historical progression that has happened within children's literature, where we are moving gradually from didacticism towards something which is extremely artistically elaborate. We have Maria Nikolajeva, who actually uses the word poly-voiced literature. There are multi-voices that you hear, and this is a typical characteristic of modern writing. I would want to bring a very well-traveled popular text, Panchatantra, which has 200 versions, translations, transcreations, adaptations in 60 languages, and close to 25 recensions, to maybe challenge this idea, to at least shake it a little, whether the pre-colonial literature is didactic. Before that, let me talk about one of the oldest children's, shared literature specimen, which falls within the domain of children's literature history making of Panchatantra, which is done by Durga Simha. This is a Kannada version of Panchatantra, and it is called Karnataka Panchatantra, done by Durga Simha. The date is somewhere between 1031 to 1130 CE. That's the range. We exactly do not know where it is placed. And the power of orality is evident in this writing, because even after committing itself to print, this work typically uses expressions like "as we have heard" or "as you have been told," which are extremely oral in nature. Interestingly, this work also shows this fluidity that we see between the pre-colonial texts. So it opens with a story from 11th century Sanskrit text Katha Sarit Sagara by Somadeva. Usually we attribute this as a framing story of Katha Sarit Sagar, and the story goes like this. Parvati wants Shiva to tell her a story which is exclusively narrated to her. There are no other listeners. In this private storytelling session between Shiva and Parvati, there's an attendant called Pushpadanta who actually sneaks in and hears a part of it and then goes and narrates it to his wife Jaya. Jaya goes back and tells it to Parvati, and Parvati is absolutely enraged. So what she does is, she actually curses Pushpadanta and his friend Malyavana, who actually ventured to intercede in this story, to be born as humans. And the solution to this curse is the culprits can resume their celestial life only when they repeat the story. So I would want to bring out the significance of why probably Durga Simha might have used this as a frame story to underline the importance of how the story needs to be passed on and how each telling is unique. Though there's a tradition, there is a unique story for all the audiences. I'd come back to this whole idea of how Panchatantra is multi-voiced literature. And this is coming from introduction by Chandra Rajan. She has given us, the categories of narration that Panchatantra brings together. So if you can see, there is narration which is happening at 6 levels. There's a story within a story, in a story, in a story, and at 6 layered levels, you have narration happening. Highly organized, complex structure with several narrators functioning at multiple levels is what you see here. An intricately designed text which nowhere is simplistic in the way, Maria Nicola Java was talking about. And one thing that I would want to highlight is the tales do not have a very Puritan way of instilling morals. I'd want to very specifically bring that out. The way the tales are organized and the fluidity of the tales ensures that it operates by posing questions rather than providing answers. And these questions demand careful scrutiny. So what we are going to do is, let me not theorize, let us listen to a story by Vikram Sridhar, again an avid expert on Panchatantra storytelling, who's joined us from Chennai. What he is going to help us do is, help us discover how Panchatantra sheds its pre-colonial introspective character to fit into clear moral schematism that we see in 20th century children's literature. So when you brand something as children's literature, you need to have characters which are black and white. There has to be a moral, but when it stays floating in the domain of shared content, there is that introspection and thinking that you would want to instill into your listeners, into your readers. So Vikram is going to render for us this tale of musical monkey or singing ass, which is from a children's book trust, a CBT 1992 version, and he is going to place it against a Punarbhadra version, which is dated as 1999 CE recension. So let's compare and see the difference between the same tale. Over to you, Vikram. Welcome, and we are all ears.
Thanks, Diti. Thanks to IIT Gandhinagar. Once they led a washerman, and the washerman had a donkey. And during the day, the donkey used to carry the load and do all the work. And in the night, it had its own time. And one such time, it made friends with a jackal. And they both spent the time in the night together, talking and talking and talking. One such time, the jackal found a huge garden and went to the donkey and said, "Uncle, you know, there are some juicy cucumbers that's there in the garden nearby." And the donkey said, "Let's go." And both of them in the night went and started munching on the cucumbers each day. First day, happy. Second day, happy. And every day, the donkey was getting a little fatter and a little plumper. And one day, the donkey just sat and told the jackal, "You know what? I feel like I want to sing because the moon is up there, the sky is dark, it's night time. I feel like singing." And the jackal replied saying, "Don't do that, because with your voice, you will wake up all the farmers and they're going to come and thrash all of us." And the donkey said, "Oh, nephew, you don't know my voice. You don't have a taste for music." And the jackal said, "Please be careful. Don't do this." But the donkey said, "You just don't understand the beauty of my music," and started to sing. And the jackal ran away to sit around the corners of the garden. And the donkey started singing in its own way, in its pitch. And when the donkey started singing, one after the other, the farmers woke up and came with their weapons and started thrashing the donkey. And the donkey continued singing until a time the donkey was completely thrashed and came out with its own tiredness. And the donkey dragged itself outside where the jackal was waiting. And the jackal said, "Dear uncle, now you know what I told you, and you shouldn't be singing. Congratulations." And the donkey said, "I'm sorry, nephew, that I did not listen to you." The story ends there in the children's version that we consume today. And we go backward to the Purnabhadra's ascension. In the 5th chapter, Aparakshita Karikam, which is rash deeds, the story appears in between two stories. The story of 100-wit, 1,000-wit, and single-wit, and the dull-witted weaver. The musical donkey, here are certain phrases which doesn't appear in the children's version. The donkey asked the jackal specifically, "Tell me which raga shall I sing?" The donkey asked the jackal, "Tell me which raga shall I sing?" And then the jackal responds and expresses that their roles as thieves and they should go about doing their duty and not doing anything else than just behaving as thieves, and mentions, "Your singing is not mellifluous like the tone of the conch." Your singing is not mellifluous like the tone of the conches. And the argument erupts, and the donkey with anger says the following: "Shame, shame, oh, you blockhead. What do you think I do not know anything about music? All right, I'll tell you the basic principles of musicology." And the donkey gives this lecture. 7 notes and 3 scale they be, with 1 and 20 modes in use, all weaving music's golden tones. 9 and 40 distinct ways music moves, bound by measures 3. In registers 3, and in strict accordance with tempos 2 and pauses 3. 6 singing styles expresses beautifully the 9 moods, which is the Navarasas, and emotions 40. Enhanced skillfully by shading and coloring 6 and 30 ways, which is the ragas, varied exquisitely. And then it goes on to say 105 and 80 songs and more of golden sound, most melodious, with subtle phrasing, delicate flourishes, and as many graceful embellishment are found set down for the skilled vocalist. There are 7, in short, there are 7 notes, 3 octaves, 21 modulations, 41 quavers, 3 concords, 3 cadence, 3 sthanas, 3 positions of pauses, 6 asyas, 9 sentiments, 36 ragas, and 40 emotions. And then the donkey sings in the story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikram, for that enthralling performance. Well, if you listen to the subtext, in the children's text, you could see the model schematism so neatly defined. But when we come to the shared literature, we would question whether the donkey actually was he a misfit? Was it because, I mean, he knew pretty much about musicology, right? He sounds like an erudite scholar for sure. So you are left with a lot of ambivalence and questions to draw your own conclusions rather than, laughing at the donkey who's making a fool of himself in the children's story. So in keeping with the spirit of Kathamukham of Panchatantra, where Vishnu Sharma or Bidpai, there are multiple names that we give to the author of the narrator author of Panchatantra, the text is meant to awaken young minds. Some translation change that word awaken to teach, but if you do a proper translation, the word is awaken. And therefore, the text leaves us with a lot of possibilities. We are supposed to wrestle and ponder and come to our own conclusions. And this is what the pre-colonial children's literature wanted the children to do, exercise their power of discretion. From the time children's literature becomes separate, it became more restrictive. It became more filtered out. It also became, unfortunately, more ignored. So from the journey so far, we can say that rather than being a mere predecessor, pre-colonial children's literature, and now we redefine it as not what is produced for children, but as what is consumed by children, is actually a Bruhat Katha. It's a grand narrative. Children's literature in pre-colonial times is a grand narrative. And this grand narrative operates by raising questions rather than answering it. The questions that it might raise is, are we correct in our assumptions about who the children are? What should be offered to the children? Should we even offer something to the children that we think right? Is it time to trace alternate histories to counter the universalizing formats of history making that are available? Shouldn't we come out of the ghetto of children's literature and form linkages and connections with the mainstream Indian literary studies? Aren't the newer, more creative formats also an extension of the same continuum, which create engaging material for children? Can't we visualize a lateral history where attempts like these, like the ones that I've talked about, the attempts to offer children the best, are valued and respected? I leave you with more questions rather than answers. Thank you so much for listening so patiently.